Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee Lavallee Mckenna, and I bring my 30-plus years as a recovering addict and ex-crazy person turned therapist and shamanic healer to bring you snackable teachings on spirituality, psychology, and all things personal growth. And today I want to talk about intuition. What is it? How can it serve us? And how might our intuition be broken? So intuition can be experienced in different ways by different people. It might be an instinct, a gut feeling. Some call it the sixth sense. And although certainly there are intuitive thoughts, generally intuition operates on a feeling level or a felt experience in our body. Now I say generally because people experience intuition all different kinds of ways. And if it's highly developed, it may even be auditory, like you might hear words or see images. And that's where this sixth sense is using some of our other five senses to make itself known to us. And I've come to believe that we have many more than just those five or even six senses. And there's a lot of neuroscience actually to back that up. But opening to those other ways of knowing really adds to our ability to gather information and make decisions in our life. And I think what we call intuition is kind of a larger basket that contains these other ways of knowing that are what I call non-rational. And that's different than irrational. In fact, irrational behavior often happens when our rational or conscious mind feels inadequate in a circumstance and our non-rational kind of breaks through and takes over. And usually that comes from a place of fear or panic and unresolved emotional issues from the past. Irrational is when we say 2 + 3 = 6. My lover didn't text me today, that must mean they're cheating on me or the relationship is over. When actually they're just busy. But there may be a time when your lover doesn't text or call and your intuition tells you that they're cheating. And you might be right. So non-rational is different than irrational because non-rational is a way to access information through these other ways of knowing that the rational or conscious mind does not have access to. The intuitive or the non-rational, again, is our body felt sensations, our felt experience, instinct or desires, even our dreams, daydreams, and can even include serendipity, which is when circumstances, events, or information comes to us externally, and it's like the universe bringing us intuitive information. I did a podcast on synchronicity, number 71. If you want to learn more, it's another word for serendipity. So it's my experience, and certainly it's what I try to facilitate in my work with clients, to use all of the resources we have and to integrate our rational and non-rational ways of gathering information and processing so we can make the best decisions possible. Because we're making decisions all the time in how we act, what we say, and how we relate to ourselves, to others, and to the larger life force. And we have these two parts of our brain. And although there's a lot of overlap, in general, the left side of the brain is the more intellectual, calculating, logical, verbal side of our brain. Left side tends to control reading and writing. It's often referred to as the more masculine side of the brain. And in the information age that we're in, many people tend to be left brain dominant. And the right side of the brain tends to be more connected with emotions, with art and music, with creativity, spatial ability, understanding meta constructs or concepts, and is really tied to our emotional processing and felt experience. Now, they aren't mutually exclusive, and they really need to work together. There's actually a lot of science behind this, and even NASA and the Pentagon are really interested in research around intuition so that pilots and soldiers and astronauts can have that cutting edge to make often life and death decisions in stressful circumstances. There's actually a whole system of neurons in our digestive tract that's loosely known as the gut brain. And most of us have probably had that gut reaction or feeling when you feel queasy, butterflies, or a little anxious, and that can be a big part of our intuition. But it's really important to integrate all of the information that we have, and the two sides of the brain are connected by this kind of neural superhighway called the corpus callosum. And optimally, our rational intellectual mind and our more intuitive, emotional, creative mind have mutual love and respect for each other. And although science is certainly interested in intuition and these other ways of knowing, when we go deeply into it, we start to move into the paranormal. And our left-brained, leaning, scientific, materially based culture often doesn't like things that aren't provable, concrete, and repeatable. I recently did a workshop with Tom Campbell. I've mentioned before, my favorite intuitive, nerdy, white physicist. And Tom's life work is to bridge this gap, kind of a cultural corpus callosum. And a lot of his trainings are about creating experiments that people can do in the larger consciousness system, what I would call the transpersonal realm, that are provable and repeatable to some extent. He works with remote viewing, intuitive healing, experiments with telepathy. It's very interesting stuff. Tom calls his work My Big Toe, or MBT. My Big Toe stands for the theory of everything. He's all over YouTube, and it's a really great organization. I'll put a link in the show notes. So intuition, in its many forms, points to the fact that there's more going on here than meets the eye or the ear, or our ordinary physical senses. I remember a pinnacle moment in the development of my mommy instincts. My son was about 1.5, still wearing a diaper, and we were out in the rain. And he was standing in front of a big puddle, and I thought, he's going to sit in that puddle. And then, of course, he sat in the puddle, and his little diaper blew up like a balloon and weighed about 14 pounds. And there was nothing tragic about it. I actually thought it was pretty funny, but I made a mental note because for me that came as an intuitive thought. I have to say, as I think about it, it even feels like it lived on the right side of my brain. And I made a commitment to myself that when those would come up with my children, that I would take action immediately, because I'd rather intervene and be helpful than watch my kid get hurt and say, oh, I knew that was going to happen. And we have to know that being a human is an imperfect science. And my children are approaching young adulthood now and asking to borrow the car. And I'll tell you, my intuition says, no. You might get in a car crash. And at this stage, it's better to just get collision on my car, make sure that they're good drivers, and send them off with prayers and good wishes, rather than to hold them back with my own fear. And I don't operate as an intuitive because my gut instincts aren't always right, and no one's had a crash yet. Maybe they won't. And even if they do, I'm in a stage of parenting now where allowing them their own life experience and managing my own feelings about that, rather than holding them back because it makes me nervous, feels like the right thing to do. So I see a lot of webinars and books and information about developing your intuition these days. And I think that's great. Counterbalancing our overly rational culture and really integrating our emotional, social, spiritual, connected, felt experience. Really important to include all of who we are in our lives. As the left brain is often referred to as the more masculine, the right brain is often seen as the more feminine, and masculine and feminine working supportively, co-informing each other as a team internally, just like in reproduction, is a very creative evolutionary process. In fact, from my perspective, the over-reliance on the intellect and this more masculine approach could be seen as the cause for misogyny, for the environmental problems we have, and even for a lot of our social suffering. So I think it's really healthy and hopeful that this idea of intuition and more feminine relational felt experience is being included in the conversation in a much more mainstream way. In my experience with myself, with clients, and just with people in general, for many of us, the intellect is exhausted. It actually doesn't know all the extra support that's available when we can open to trust our own intuition in the larger transpersonal realms that have our highest good in mind. But the Equal Rights Amendment has not been passed. And although it's part of the discussion, on a personal level, many people have a questionable relationship with their intuition. And particularly if you grew up with dysfunction, abuse, or neglect, your relationship with your own intuition may be damaged. I know mine was. We live in a culture of mass emotional suppression. We're supposed to be happy all the time. And the deeper, messier, maybe darker feelings and intuitions are pushed away or pressed down. And I believe this is one of the major causes of depression, the pressing down of our instincts, intuitions, and felt experience. I did a whole chapter in my book on depression. It has 3 powerful guided inner journeys that are really helpful in opening up those doors. As a child, I was ridiculed for having feelings. Some people are told when they're crying, I'll give you something to cry about, because their parents are uncomfortable with sadness or being confronted with their own dysfunction in the responses of their children. I know for myself, I was told everything is fine. What's wrong with you? And it wasn't until adulthood that it's very clear to me that everything was not fine and that my feelings were completely healthy and appropriate for the circumstances. But the level of unconsciousness and unwillingness to grow and change, my parents' need to see themselves as perfect, inhibited their ability to be present and grow. And that's often what intuition does. It points to a deeper truth that may be inconvenient. And so for me, I came to believe that my feelings were irrelevant and broken and just a source of suffering, and I did everything I could to make them go away, including drinking myself into blackouts and staying as high and disconnected from my felt experience as I could for a long time. And there's lots of ways we can distract ourselves from our intuition. In fact, I was working with someone who calls himself an intuitive, and when I asked him to come into his body so we could do some inner journey work, he said, "Oh, I don't do that." Excuse me? No, I don't come into my body. Really? That's interesting. No, I'm just connected spiritually. I'm a spiritual being having a human experience, and I don't really want to have a human experience. I'd rather just be a spiritual being. Whoa. Okay. Well, we are having a human experience, and again, integrating those is very important. And when I was able to get him in his body, he has tremendous rage and despair, which don't really go with his idealized self-image of himself as a spiritual being who's forgiving and unconditionally loving. That's called spiritual bypass, where we want to skip over the human work and stay in spiritual bliss. But we have bodies for a reason. So it's really about integrating all of our different ways of knowing, all of our different ways of receiving and processing information that makes us whole, empowered, and fulfilled. And that's not a place we get to. It's a skill we practice. It's like I live a few blocks from Ocean Beach in San Francisco. It's a pretty advanced surfing area, and I love to watch people surf. It's a metaphor for life. We got to wait for the wave. Each wave is different. We can stay on the board for a little while, and eventually we come off and we do it again. And integrating our intellect and our intuition is very much like surfing. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen, or share it with a friend. You can check me out on Instagram at Renee Lavallee Mckenna, working on finishing up a digital course on the introduction to shamanism. Keep you posted on that. If you want to find out how spiritual psychology might benefit you in your life or learn about my mentorship program, shoot me an email, info@reneemckenna.com. Thanks as always to my supporters on Patreon. Blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee Lavallee Mckenna for Spiritual Psychology.